Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Goodman, Director of Corporate at WPA, and welcome to our latest webinar. Today, we're going to cover another highly topical subject, the stresses and strains of working in a virtual environment, a clinical perspective. This is particularly relevant following some of the latest changes and updates announced yesterday. We are really lucky to have two consultant psychiatrists to give that clinical perspective, Dominic de Souza and Filippo Passetti, who have some fascinating viewpoints on mental well-being. They'll speak for around 20 minutes each, and then I'll chair a question and answer sessions, and we will be finished by 3 o'clock. You can type questions at any time during their presentations. For some of you, the dialogue box may already be open, and for others, there is a red arrow in the top right of the screen, which will open it. Click on the questions tab, and you can type your question there, and we will see how many we can get through. Our first speaker is Dominic de Souza from Cognacity. Dominic trained in Australia and London and has been a consultant psychiatrist since 2007, working across both the NHS and private sector. He is a Royal College examiner and tutor and is also WPA's psychiatric advisor. So without stealing his thunder, over to you, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Brian, for the introduction and for having me today. So today I'm going to talk about the impact of coronavirus on mental health, working in our new virtual working environment. I'm going to touch on the issue of burnout as a precursor to serious mental health conditions and what organisations can do to help employers. I was hoping to give you a range of ideas to create a support strategy or toolkit that works for your organisation. I've also added some references at the end that will help you in order to do this. One message I did want to get across was that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't quite fit in this case, and we need to use an individualized approach. So how does it affect you? Well, I think we can all agree that coronavirus has forced the majority of us into a very different living and working situation than we were used to. It's upended our usual routine, and it stopped us being able to do our jobs the way we used to. For some, it's been very positive. We've not had a commute to work, we've had a better work-life balance, we've had more family time, we've been able to do the housework, and it's led to perhaps greater productivity. But for others, it's actually been much more of a struggle. People have been more socially isolated, coping poorly with lack of structure and routine, dealing with uncertainty, and also maybe not having the workspace and environment at home, and not having the right technology. It's also been complicated by childcare issues, dealing with the health of family members. So it's been a very mixed bag, really. I think what you need to know is that if an individual is struggling, they'll likely be unhappy, they'll likely be unproductive, and this may lead eventually to burnout. And I think this is especially important given that we're entering into a second wave and potentially second lockdown. So I'm sure you all recognize this. Like me, I find lots of video conferences extremely draining, especially if you've had several in one day. The conversations usually feel very stilted. There's very little opportunity to decompress in between meetings. But there's actually quite a few important factors that you need to think about. And these have been the factors identified in psychological research. So usually when we make video calls, there's probably an increased self-awareness of what we look like. We're staring at ourselves and we actually put a bit more effort into how we look. There's also a volume issue. We tend to overschedule at the moment because possibly we have more time, there's less of a commute. And on average, we're having one more meeting each day than we used to. There's also a lot more efforts that we use in order to gauge non-verbal cues and body language. We're not really used to staring at our colleagues for long periods of time, and so in video meetings we're often staring at our colleagues for at least at least half a minute at a time, and that sometimes makes people quite uncomfortable. And also that we have the IT problems which often lead to speech transmission delays, and that in a way can lead to you misinterpreting what the other person is saying. So why is this so important? Well, I think with the coronavirus, it's had a huge impact on people's mental health. And this was an important project that was undertaken in July this year, where they asked over 2,000 people how they felt in the last 2 weeks. And the results were approximately half, about 49%, felt anxious and very worried. More than 1 in 5 people felt very lonely. 1 in 6 had felt hopeless. 1 in 8 had felt panicked. 10% had felt suicidal, had some suicidal feelings in the past 2 weeks. Women were tending to report feeling anxious, lonely, and depressed far more than men. And many were engaging in a few more harmful behaviors, such as drinking, substance misuse, etc. And also the young were reporting feeling more hopeless than the older population. So, from the organizational perspective, companies really need to anticipate and recognize burnout before it leads to a serious mental illness. But what is burnout? Well, burnout occurs when passionate, committed people become deeply disillusioned with a job or career from which they have previously derived much of their identity and meaning. It comes as the things that inspire passion and enthusiasm are stripped away and tedious or unpleasant things crowd in. So, how do we recognize it? Well, there's 3 main aspects to burnout. The first is emotional exhaustion, and that's really when people feel persistently tired all the time. It's not just the odd day. Then there's depersonalization, so you don't feel yourself. You're maybe more cynical, more irritable than you used to be. The sense of satisfaction you have in your job isn't quite the same as it used to be. So maybe if we focus on the energy side of things. So this is an energy check wheel that really demonstrates what happens to your energy levels when you're performing well and also when you're burning out. So ideally, we want to be performing on the right side of the circle. So oscillating between the performance zone and the recovery zone. So usually when we're at work and performing well in our tasks, we feel energized, we feel confident, we feel engaged, all the performance emotions described there. And usually after the task is complete, we have some time off, we have a break, a coffee break, maybe go for a walk. During lunchtime, we'd go out to grab a sandwich. So we have these built-in periods during our day when we have with the ability to recover. And usually during the recovery zone, we feel emotions such as carefree, calm, peaceful. But what happens is that if that doesn't work well, we often start to drift towards the left-hand side, which is into the survival zone and the burnout zone. And in survival zone, we feel defiant, annoyed, fearful, irritable, impatient. And eventually, if you let that go on for a long period, you eventually burn out. Now, what we want to do is really set up the appropriate policies and procedures and think about staffing in order to manage this properly. Elite athletes are very good at this, and they have a whole team around them in order to manage and optimize their performance and actually optimize their recovery. And they often focus just as much on the performance aspect as the recovery aspect. So what I think we need to ask ourselves and also our workforce is how that might have changed during the coronavirus epidemic. Often I think people describe that their recovery periods have changed, especially if they're working from home. Maybe they don't put in typically their usual coffee breaks, their usual walk to get a sandwich. So you can see how that might impact on your performance during the day. So one of the important things we need to identify is if we're presenting with presenteeism, which is actually maybe more costly or just as costly as absenteeism. So one question to ask yourself and maybe think about your colleagues is, have you been at work in the past year when you were physically or psychologically unfit? Yes or no? I mentioned that one of the key aspects of burnout was personal accomplishment and a sense of satisfaction. So this is a useful exercise just to do yourselves and see if it applies to you. So if you could possibly give yourself a point for every yes answer to the following questions and then work out your total score, and I'll come back to that at the end. So the first question is, do you find your work rewarding? Is your work one of the most important things in your life? Do you think your work makes the world a better place? Do you enjoy talking about your work to others? Would you choose your work life again? And would you continue with your current work even if you were no longer paid, as you were financially stable or perhaps won the lottery? So if everyone can total up their score, so on average, most of us would score 4 or 5. There's a few of us who maybe scored 6, and perhaps you're in the perfect job for yourself. But if you scored less than 4, so 1, 2, or 3, you may want to ask yourself, are you burning out? So how do we tackle burnout? So we've all heard about resilience, but what does that mean? So I think we need to think about it from the individual and the organizational perspective. So from the individual perspective, it's really the ability to bounce back from the negative effects of stresses and challenges, and to remain positive in the face of adversity. From the organizational perspective, it's really the system's ability to respond flexibly to new and unexpected demands. And this is especially important during coronavirus, because I think it's really difficult for us to anticipate what's going to happen in the next 6 months. So I think as an organization, we need to be really thinking about what changes might occur, what might happen during Christmas time, and how does that mean? What does that mean for our families, for the workplace? And from all the evidence that we have, what we found is that the organizations that are good at implementing interventions to reduce, to improve resilience, that actually leads to the best and healthiest workforce. So the question is, are you anticipating all the challenges at the moment with the coronavirus and entering into our second wave? So this is also a useful concept to think about from the organizational perspective. So this is the psychosocial safety climate. So it's really a concept to look at the climate for psychological health and safety. So we all know we're often trying to balance job demands and resources, but I think the ability to manage and enjoy our jobs is down to a variety of other factors. So not just the job demands and resources. So what researchers have found is that these other factors are equally important. So the level of control we have in our job, the sense of reward, what the community is, what's the culture within the organization, is there a sense of fairness, and also the values. One example I'd like to sort of describe is with medical colleagues I have who go abroad to work in voluntary organizations in the developing world. They often describe when they come back that they had huge job demands and very limited resources. But what you often find is they've been extremely energized and enthused about their jobs and are desperate to go back and repeat their experience. And what you often see is that these other factors have been crucially important for them. So the sense of control, the reward, not just the financial reward, and the community, the sense of fairness, and the values. So thinking about our entering into the second wave, what does an organization need to think about? So I suppose we need to take each of these factors in turn. So with workload, is the workload too much or too little? Is there flexibility, especially if people are working from home? And are we considering the issue of children and parents? What is the level of control? Are people working way over the hours? That's quite common with the lack of commute. Are people involved in decisions? What's the reward? And not just the financial reward, is there acknowledgement for good work? How are promotions organized during the coronavirus? What's the culture within the organization? Do people tend to blame others, or is it a very supportive culture? Is there a sense of fairness? And what are the values within the organization? What we've seen is that women are generally disproportionately affected and have been during the coronavirus. So is that taken into account when thinking about fairness? So these are just a few ideas I thought I'd describe in order to help you put together a toolkit to support your staff. So thinking about it from the individual perspective, I suppose what you need to consider is, have they presented with burnout, and do they need to be referred to a specialist like myself for an assessment, or perhaps even to access counselling? It's important that you have a one-to-one conversation with your employees. Actually find out what their personal circumstances are and how they're working from home. What's happened to their routine? Are they emulating a usual work routine, or has that all gone to pot at home? Are they getting up in the mornings and having their usual coffee? What are they doing if they're not commuting? Often I recommend going for a walk during that period of the commute and getting changed prior to that. It's important that you think about their work environment and what how they work and where they work from. Are they working in their bedrooms? Often what we're seeing is that this is impacting on the quality of sleep for employees. Do they have a dedicated workspace? And what you want to really assess is do they have separate work and sleep zones? And do they have the right skills and tech set up at home? You want to have a discussion about their recovery activities. What's they doing? And is that the same as what they were doing when they were back in the office? There's certain toolkits that are available online. One really useful one is the Mind Wellness Action Plan. A few other things I'd like to sort of mention is that it's often important to be able to live with being less than perfect, especially during this period of the coronavirus, and also empower and allow your colleagues to say no if they feel things are unsafe for them. It's often useful to delegate and try and redefine work if you can. So perhaps recommend that they have a separate login for personal and work accounts. Some brief tips for managing virtual meetings. So keeping the audience engaged is vitally important in trying to deal with burnout. Limit the number of meetings. Often we're seeing people having one or more meetings than they used to pre-burnout, pre-lockdown. Social and daily check-in meetings are extremely useful. And thinking about their recovery time, this can be something as simple as taking 5 deep breaths in and 5 deep breaths out over the course of a minute, or perhaps looking out of the window and noticing 5 sounds. That in itself can be quite relaxing. Consideration of breakout groups and co-facilitation actually makes virtual meetings much more manageable, and recommending to your colleagues that they go for walks and fresh air in between meetings is also useful. Often at work, we have a combination of video and phone meetings just to break up the monotony during the day. So I'd like to just leave you with a few really, really useful resources that I've found. So the first is the power of engagement, and that looks at the energy side of things and how we maintain our energy in work and optimize our performance. The Mental Health at Work website is a really useful website to help organizations and managers develop toolkits for their employees. The last two, the Mind website and the Maudsley Learning website, have also very useful resources in order to help staff manage at home and working virtually. So thanks very much for listening to me today, and I'd just like to leave you with one of the most important aspects of managing burnout is to make sure that you offer gratitude regularly and repeatedly with your colleagues. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Some insightful thoughts and observations for everyone. I was particularly taken by the adverse effect that online working can have on an individual. It's something we should all be aware of. Our second speaker today is Filippo Passetti, who, after studying medicine in Florence, trained in psychiatry in Cambridge and London. Filippo has recently become increasingly interested in resilience and stress-related disorders, including addiction and gambling treatment services. Whether this has anything to do with the fact that he's recently taken up skateboarding and kite surfing or anything else on the slippery surface, I don't know, but perhaps we'll find out. Filippo.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for that kind introduction. And I'll give you the answer about the skateboarding later. But just to get straight into the subject matter of my part of this talk today, I will echo a lot of the points that Dominic has made in his presentation, except I will try and give you a much more personal journey through those issues, particularly the role of uncertainty and the loss of routine affecting the way we manage our energy, so the pace of our work-life balance. So in the next 10 minutes, I will skateboard through some of my reflections on how all this has affected psychiatric service provision and how it may affect that in the future, as well as perhaps not so much tips as Dominic has done, but perhaps give you some thoughts about the way employers might think about the things that they do to support their employees in the future. And I will start by introducing a concept that I, with my colleagues at Cognacity, am particularly keen on, which is this idea of a spectrum of mental health. So mental health is not a black and white thing. We all sit somewhere along that spectrum. You might have seen this. This is from the Wellbeing Institute in Cambridge. So we all sit somewhere along the spectrum. The majority of us in that light blue section in the middle. Some of us in the orange, highly resilient, high performance individuals. The section to the right of this curve, and a minority of us, perhaps one in six, in the dark blue section to the left. You know, the part of the spectrum that includes people with mental disorders. So the idea here is that regardless of where you sit on that spectrum, no one is immune to sliding down to the left of that spectrum. So from flourishing to mental wellness, through languishing and to mental disorder. But here's the good news as well. Everyone can benefit from evidence-based intervention to push you towards the right. So the other way around, to mental wellness and to flourishing. So moving quickly to what I've seen, I've divided this in three sections: during lockdown, after lockdown, and second wave. During the lockdown, of course, is when uncertainty was particularly troubling. There was nothing really that we could refer to in the past, in our past experience. And we knew from reviews like this. So in addition, there was, of course, all the consequences of lockdown, being forced to isolate in your own homes. And we knew from reviews like this that there will be lots and lots of psychological consequences of these circumstances. And so we were all bracing for a flood of ill people knocking at our doors, asking to be seen. And in fact, there was much more of a mixed picture. And Dominic already referred to some of this. So for people in the light blue section, simply the fact that you did not have to commute and you had more time, you could slow down a bit, more time for your family, more time for your pastimes, did benefit the mental health of some of us. But also, if you look at the other sections here, think about someone with a depressive or an anxiety disorder who maybe for many months, or many weeks, or perhaps even months, has been struggling to leave the house and go to work. Now, suddenly, these individuals were much more similar to the rest of the population. Think also about someone with obsessive compulsive disorder who maybe has been contending with issues of contamination for months or years, and suddenly they were much more similar to the rest of the population. And even in the flourishing group, the orange group, so it may be that at the beginning of the epidemic, the new challenge offered energized people. It offered a positive surge of adrenaline, and these changes were mirrored, in my experience, also in organizations. Initially there was worry, but also a great sense of energy, and also a general sense of wanting to help each other that perhaps you would not have seen as much before, in the same way, at least. Now, in the post-lockdown phase is when we saw a lot more referrals for psychological conditions directly related to COVID. First of all, of course, lots of anxiety disorders. COVID-19 affects the respiratory system in a very virulent way, causing a particularly troublesome air hunger. And this, in turn, is a very powerful stimulus for a trigger for anxiety. And what struck me in particular in the summer was to see so many people without a prior history of anxiety disorder or other mental disorder, people who were highly resilient individuals developing these disorders, typically in the days as they were getting better from COVID, or sometimes even later, on their first week back at work. And then the other new thing, I suppose, was the striking presentation was long COVID. So this is when someone recovers from all the acute symptoms of COVID, the fever, the cough, and so on, but the energy and the concentration don't come back. We don't quite know exactly why that happens, but there are two schools of thought. The first is that this is similar to other post-viral fatigue syndromes. Think of ME after Epstein-Barr infection. But there are also those who instead think that there is something very specific about COVID that causes these prolonged syndromes. And they point to the fact that the COVID virus is quite good at activating coagulation, and so it can cause clots, microscopic clots in the lung and in the brain. I don't know if you're seeing this window. I'll put it down. Microscopic clots in the lung and the brain, and these are in turn what causes the problems with concentration, the problems with energy. And against this idea, there is of course the fact that it's very difficult to reveal in investigations the differences between long COVID and, let's call it, normal COVID, and also the fact that very often people who get this particular presentation have had another post-viral fatigue before. So, for example, they've had ME before, suggesting that perhaps there is a psychological type that is associated with this presentation. Now we come finally to the phase that we are living in now, the second wave. And if you compare this to the phase of the lockdown, there is still a lot of uncertainty, only slightly different kind of things. Is it safe for me to go back to work? Is it safe for me to send my children back to school? Should I shake hands in my next meeting? But the other element, as Dominic explained earlier, is that there is this legacy of 6 months of uncertainty. And this is a problem because most people can sustain a great deal of pressure for a limited specified period of time, but not indefinitely, because our stress responses are designed for short-term physical challenges and not for prolonged ones. And if we are forced to stay in a state of stress for a very long time, you've seen this slide before, we are all liable to slide down that trajectory that goes through fatigue, exhaustion, burnout, and then further down the line, the stress-related disorders, depression, generalized anxiety disorders, and so on. So in the final bit of my presentation, I wanted to discuss a few of these elements, more specifically relating to psychiatry, how it has changed as a result of the epidemic, and how probably some of these changes will last at least for many months from now. And of course, the first most obvious change is that we now all do remote consultations, and which would have been unthinkable before March 2020. And if I had more time, I will tell you all the things that I've discovered about the pros and cons of remote consultation. But much, the much broader change, I would say, is the greater emphasis on preventative approaches to mental health, by which I mean, of course, working across the spectrum of mental health that I showed you earlier, to increase awareness, to increase resilience. And of course, this comes now because we know that those resilience eroding factors that we have been discussing do exist and will affect us all and will stay with us for a long time. And so early recognition and signposting becomes, in a sense, the name of the game. Now, the other consequence of this change is that this new approach inevitably requires psychiatrists and psychologists to work more closely with organizations, for example, to develop mental health expertise within those organizations, things like mental health first aid programs, mental health advocacy programs, and so on, and also to develop resilience building programs to reduce individual vulnerability, as well as, of course, treatment and working collaboratively with HR departments, employers, and so on. Again, staying on my personal experience, so these are some of the interventions that psychiatrists and psychologists will find themselves more and more involved in. But again, coming back to my experience, Cognacity first started taking this approach in 2010 when we developed a program for BP at the time of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And at that point, the whole organization was going through a massive crisis, or a period of extreme pressure, in some ways similar to what most organizations have been going through during the months of the epidemic. And Cognacity put together initially just a single evidence-based workshop to help their workforce perform under pressure. And this was rolled out first in their legal divisions, then across other divisions. And then on the basis of this, on that platform, lots of other different interventions have been developed to do all those things that I said before, increase awareness and build resilience in organizations. And little by little, many organizations have followed in the path of BP and have benefited from some of these interventions. And the final point that I wanted to make is I wanted to tell you the story of one of the things that have happened during the epidemic. One of the things that Cognacity, the organization for which I work, have done to try and help organizations that were going through these pressured circumstances. And so the idea here was to deliver an expert webcast series where one psychiatrist or a psychologist will join a CEO or an HR director on a live broadcast to look at recent business and to look at recent well-being developments. And this was a very good way of reaching a very large audience in large organizations and getting firstly something of a signature of the stress response in the organization, so the stress signature of the organization, but also to get a sense of which particular interventions might be helpful for that organization, and so on the basis of that, then a whole program of webinars, targeted and tailored webinars were developed and delivered in this organization, this particular organization. And I'll finish there on only 3 minutes over my 10 minutes mark. Thank you very much.
Filippo, thank you. We forgive you. It was well worth the extra 2 or 3 minutes, so much appreciated. For me, one of the big concerns is the potential for burnout, as the current pressure extends from the last 6 months, where people have been, over summer, to the sort of next 6 months or so over the winter period, and I see that as being a big issue. So thank you both. We said you'd be thought-provoking, and you were. Now, the questions have been coming in thick and fast. So first one I'm going to put to yourself, Filippo. You mentioned interventions for improving resilience in your presentation. Could you give us a few examples of these, or an example?
Yes. So Dominic has mentioned some of the themes which are about managing managing your time, managing your energy. There is particularly this idea that unless you introduce some pockets of rest and recovery in your day, your mental health is bound to decline. And you should really learn from elite athletes for whom rest and recovery after a competition is part of their job. It's not something that you do if you have time or if you feel like it. It's part of their job, and it's the kind of things that you do in order to perform optimally the next time around, at the next competition. But then the one aspect that we haven't covered is managing your thoughts, which is the more psychological aspect of managing or improving someone's resilience. So learn how to tell stories to yourself about your circumstances, past, present, and future, that are helpful and not unhelpful, that minimize stress rather than maximizing it.
One for Dominic, if I may. Many people were quite worried coming back into the office for the first time following lockdown and working from home, and it's likely that's going to commence again now in some parts of the country. What would you recommend employers can do to help their staff and colleagues? I don't know. I think we may have lost Dominic. Filippo, perhaps I'm hoping you heard that question. Perhaps you'd just be able to give us what advice that employers can give for employees coming back down after lockdown.
Can you hear me? So yes. So one of the things that we have learned, also reading some of the literature that I referred, I showed one article from the Lancet early on in our history of the epidemic in the UK. One of the things that we have learned is that anything that employers can do to reduce that sense of uncertainty is helpful to help people get back, to support people back to work. So we've learned that communication here is crucial, and so reaching out and being honest and about the challenges and the areas of uncertainty, but also reassuring on those things that employers can reassure their workforce is key to encourage people back to work safely and confidently.
Okay. Now, I know that Dominic, I think, is just having some sound issues, so he's going to be dialing back in a moment or two. So in that case, maybe we'll get a third on the bounce, so to speak. You mentioned in your presentation about the importance of helping leaders manage their own stress. Could you give an example of the way in which psychiatrists or psychologists might help with that?
Yes. Again, Dominic mentioned some of these aspects, not specifically in relation to leaders, but certainly, so all those things that apply to improving resilience and helping people perform optimally under pressure, all those things apply to leaders first and foremost. If you want a program of resilience building and mental health awareness to be successful, it has to start with the leaders. And Dominic was mentioning at one point this idea that we tend to be much harsher with ourselves than with others, and so helping, and this is particularly common in people who are in senior leadership positions. To be harsh with herself. Should thinking is the technical term for that cognitive style. And so unless so the awareness about the link between that and mental health problems is learned at the senior leadership role, it will not flow through, I think, and it will impede the effectiveness of some of these global interventions.
Okay. Dominic, have we got you back in any form? Not quite yet, I don't think. Dominic, if you do get some sound back in, please let us know. We'll join you in.
I can hear it, but it's cutting out, so I'll try my best.
Okay. Dominic, just wondered if you could perhaps give us an indication. Do we see, following up from Filippo's answer there, do we see the sort of stress and illnesses perhaps affecting leaders more than staff, or vice versa, or is it just across the board and there's no specific sort of differentiation? Filippo, perhaps you can pick up on that one as well.
Yes, so there is a host of factors there that are at play. So I said earlier how the people who are more on the right, towards the orange bit of the mental health spectrum, are much more likely to respond to a challenge with a sense of wanting to perform, wanting to being energized, and a positive surge of adrenaline. So I think we have Dominic back, but that's that's not all that is important in this, because of course people who are in senior leadership position have a much broader view of the challenges ahead, and they have much more managerial headaches to resolve. So in a sense, they're juggling more things, and we know that if you're juggling lots of things, if you're trying to juggle lots of things, that's stressful per se. So I don't know if I've answered your questions. It's one of those, yes, on one hand this, on the other hand that, I would say.
Okay, so one of the other questions that we've had coming in is, what's been the availability of private psychiatry during the last 6 months, and how do you see that moving forward over the winter period? Do you see any changes on that?
Dominic?
Dominic, I think, I'm not sure if you can hear us.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would say that in private practice, there's been a very different picture. So during the lockdown, paradoxically, and also a little while after the end of the lockdown, we had lots of availability, because people just did not go to see their GPs to be referred, while of course NHS services were overwhelmed, and we have heard from Dominic about the increased numbers of incidents of domestic violence, the increased numbers of suicide attempts, particularly with violent methods. And the NHS, there's been a very different picture. And plus, of course, NHS staff were much more often at the front line, while in private practice, very, very quickly, we went to a remote consultation mode. Now, in future, I think that things will remain very much in that vein. So I think that the NHS services will become even more stretched, while private practice may have perhaps an expanding availability.
Okay. Dominic, you talked a little bit earlier about with your Filippo, with the circle with people moving from a period of resilience, having a bit of a rest, rather like the sports people having their post exertion forced resting. We've had 5 or 6 months of really difficult conditions, but they have been during the summer. So with this current second wave and potentially some more local lockdowns, this is going to be surely quite a large sort of building effect of additional stress, building on people, without, I'm guessing, them having had the opportunity for the equivalent of a bit of a rest and a breakdown. How would you agree with that, or what would your observations be?
Absolutely. I think we've all probably majority of us haven't been able to have our usual 1 or 2 week breaks during the summer, and I think we're all struggling. And I think what we need to do is try and find ways in which we can incorporate the breaks into our week, really. And it's about trying to be as boundaried as we can with our work. I think it's important that we, especially if we're working from home, we know exactly when to turn everything off and turn off from work in order to kind of focus on the recovery aspect, which most of us would have done probably on the commute back from work. That's when the recovery starts in the evenings, and often I think we find that we don't have that now built into our day. So I think it's about creating that structure that we've lost in a way, and actually planning ahead. So I think thinking about the long term. So it may be that you do need to maybe think about how you restructure your home environment. Lots of people are sort of putting in home gyms and such if you've got that ability. So it's about thinking creatively with what you have, I think, in order to create those recovery periods during your working week, and actually really focusing on them just as much as you would do at work.
Yeah. Filippo, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, my answer to your skateboarding question, so I learned how to kite surf a few years ago, and in the summer I would have kite surfed somewhere, but unfortunately I couldn't. So all I could do was skateboard in the street in front of my house, which was enormously helpful from those resilience perspective, but not quite the same thing, if I may say.
Question for both of you, more from a sort of personal note. My mother's in her early 90s, thankfully fit and well, living by herself. Is there a sort of a guilt thing that how perhaps people, I know I make sure I have to speak to her and see her as regular as I can, and of course I'm trying to be careful, but it must be very difficult for people if family and parents are living perhaps hundreds of miles away. Any tips for how people can help their loved ones and probably themselves at the same time? Dominic.
Well, I think some of the older generation are actually coping maybe somewhat better than some of the very younger population, because I think their lives haven't been dramatically changed, I think, during lockdown. I think, but I think it's about from my perspective with my family, it's about ensuring that they have the right technology at home in order to maintain that communication via video link. I think that's crucial during the lockdown, especially if you're not able to see them in person. But also having that conversation with them about what they're doing in their week, and with the activities that they may not be able to get to with the lockdown, how they may be spending that time that they would have done going to a particular group or event. So I think it's trying to, as I described before, trying to emulate as best as you can what you were doing before, and maybe replacing things you can't do now with other things. Yeah.
Okay. I have one final question for both of you. If there was one thing that you would like organisations to take out or take away this afternoon, what would it be in our last couple of minutes?
We've heard about we've heard this planning mantra before. So what I've learned in these years in which, as part of Cognacity, I've been liaising with organizations about their mental well-being strategy, is that improvised solutions often are ineffective. So, for example, lots of organizations offer, training organizations offer one-off resilience seminars or workshops. They tend not to stick. It's much better to have a rolling program of interventions, including resilience and other things perhaps, and tailor those interventions to the particular culture and needs of your organization.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's about really having that individualized approach with your staff members, having those conversations about what their fears and thoughts are about their working environment, how they're managing through lockdown, and sort of a buzz phrase I use is appreciative inquiry. So actually, when you're talking about the challenges that people are facing, you're actually trying to focus on positives as well as the negatives. So when you're talking to them, you're sort of trying to get across that it's been a struggle, but they've done particularly well to cope with the stresses, and then that in turn lets you have a much more open and frank, I think, decision about the difficulties people are having. So it's about trying to really get to know your staff and finding out what's going on for them in order to kind of put in place the right support package for them during the lockdown.
Okay. And for those younger members of staff, go on, Filippo.
So I know that some leaders have a worry board in their office where they detail, they have a list of the people that they are particularly worried about, and they do just that, just what Dominic was suggesting now, take an individual approach and be able to reach out to them individually, knowing their circumstances, knowing what matters for them.
Okay. Now, I was going to say, we're getting our hours just about up. So I'm sorry for those whose questions we haven't been able to answer and discuss with Filippo and Dominic. But the plan is to pull them all together, and we'll come back to you with a brief write-up and the recording, which you'll be welcome to share with your colleagues and friends. We will also shortly be sharing details of our next webinar planned for Thursday, the 26th of November, so a date for your diaries, which is going to be on the subject of women's health in the workplace, with two inspiring, extremely knowledgeable speakers lined up for that one too. So as you depart this afternoon, it'd be really helpful if you could just take 30 seconds to fill in the quick survey, particularly the question about future topics that you'd like to hear about and for us to cover. So finally, it just leaves me to thank you for coming, and a very heartfelt thanks to two great and insightful speakers. Sorry, Dominic, you had a couple of gremlins there for a moment, but not during the presentation, so fantastic. You've given us a great deal to think about. So thank you all. Please stay fit and well, keep in touch, and we'll speak soon. Thank you very much.